When travelers first arrive in Japan, they often marvel at the serene beauty of Mount Fuji rising above the landscape, its snow-capped peak reflected in lakes and immortalized in countless woodblock prints. What those same travelers might not immediately grasp is that they are standing on one of the most geologically violent archipelagos on Earth. Japan sits precariously at the intersection of 4 tectonic plates, creating a landscape dotted with over 100 active volcanoes. During the Feudal period, from the 12th century through the mid-19th century, these mountains of fire erupted with alarming regularity, spewing ash that could blacken the sky for days, burying villages under meters of volcanic debris, and triggering famines that should have, by all logical accounts, collapsed the intricate feudal system that governed the islands. Yet feudal Japan did not collapse. It adapted, rebuilt, and developed a sophisticated network of survival mechanisms that allowed civilization to persist, even when mountains themselves exploded. The answer to this resilience lies not in any single innovation, but in the complex interplay of geography, social organization, economic flexibility, and a cultural philosophy that viewed disaster not as an aberration, but as an inevitable feature of existence. To understand how volcanic disasters failed to destroy feudal Japan, we must first understand the precarious foundation upon which this society was built. The Japanese archipelago stretches along the Pacific Ring of Fire, and nearly 75% of the land is mountainous, leaving only narrow coastal plains and river valleys for agriculture. Every square meter of arable land was precious, measured and taxed in units of rice production called koku. One koku represented approximately 180 liters of rice, theoretically enough to feed one person for a year. The entire feudal economy revolved around this measurement. Samurai received stipends in koku, taxes were collected in koku, and a domain's wealth was calculated in its total koku production. This meant that volcanic eruptions posed an existential threat, not just to individual farmers, but to the entire hierarchical structure of feudal society. When Mount Asama erupted violently in the summer of 1783, during the Tenmei era, it demonstrated exactly how fragile this system could be. The eruption began with a series of tremors that rattled the surrounding provinces for weeks, a warning that the mountain people understood all too well. Then, on the 5th day of the 7th month, Asama exploded with catastrophic force. Eyewitness accounts preserved in temple records describe a column of ash and smoke that rose so high it seemed to pierce the heavens, turning day into night across the Kanto region. The explosive force generated pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and volcanic material that raced down the mountain slopes at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, obliterating everything in their path. Entire villages vanished in minutes, their wooden structures reduced to charcoal, their inhabitants given no chance to flee. But the immediate destruction was only the beginning of the disaster. So the ash that billowed from Asama's crater drifted eastward on the prevailing winds, blanketing the rice paddies of the Kanto plain with a gray, suffocating layer of volcanic material. This ash was not merely dirt that could be washed away. It was composed of tiny shards of volcanic glass, silica particles that contaminated water sources and made them undrinkable. The ash clogged irrigation channels, settled into the delicate rice plants, and chemically altered the soil composition. Farmers who attempted to continue working their fields found that the ash abraded their skin and, when inhaled, caused respiratory distress that left even healthy men gasping for breath. The summer sun, already weakened by the ash cloud that lingered in the stratosphere, could barely penetrate to ground level. Temperatures dropped, and the rice plants, deprived of adequate sunlight, failed to mature properly. The harvest of 1783 was catastrophic, with some regions reporting yields at less than 30% of normal. The following year was worse, as the ash remained in the atmosphere, creating a volcanic winter that extended across northern Japan. In the immediate aftermath of such an eruption, the first challenge was not reconstruction, but simple survival. The contamination of water sources represented an acute crisis that required immediate solutions. In feudal Japan, Most villages relied on mountain streams and shallow wells for their water supply. When volcanic ash infiltrated these sources, the water became cloudy with suspended particles and took on a bitter, metallic taste. Drinking this water caused severe gastrointestinal distress, and many of the most vulnerable, particularly infants and the elderly, died from dehydration in the days following major eruptions. The solution developed by experienced villagers was labor-intensive but effective. They constructed makeshift filtration systems using layers of charcoal, sand, and cloth stretched over wooden frames. Water was poured through these filters multiple times, each passage removing more of the volcanic contaminants. Charcoal, already widely produced for heating and cooking, proved particularly effective at absorbing the chemical compounds leached from the volcanic ash. Village headmen organized work parties to construct these filtration stations near surviving water sources, prioritizing locations where spring water emerged from rock formations, as these sources were less contaminated than surface streams. The protection of food stores was equally critical. Every village and town maintained rice storehouses called kura, sturdy buildings with thick earthen walls designed to regulate temperature and humidity to preserve grain. These structures became focal points of survival during volcanic disasters. The thick walls that normally protected rice from summer heat and winter cold now served to keep out the invasive volcanic ash. Village officials, working under the authority of the local daimyo, organized teams to seal every gap in the kura with wet clay and rice paste, creating an airtight barrier against contamination. Inside these storehouses, the existing rice reserves represented the difference between survival and starvation. The calculation was brutally simple. But if a village had 300 residents, and each required approximately 180 liters of rice per year, the minimum reserve needed to survive until the next harvest was 54,000 liters. Few villages maintained such extensive reserves in normal times, as the tax system demanded that surplus rice be shipped to the daimyo's castle towns. During volcanic crises, this system showed both its strengths and weaknesses. The rigid social hierarchy of feudal Japan, often criticized for its inflexibility, actually provided a framework for rapid disaster response that might be envied by modern emergency management systems. At the top of the hierarchy sat the shogun in Edo, now Tokyo, whose authority theoretically extended across all of Japan. Below him were the daimyo, the feudal lords, who controlled specific domains and answered directly to the shogun. Each daimyo maintained a bureaucracy of samurai administrators who managed everything from tax collection to road maintenance. When news of a volcanic disaster reached a daimyo's castle, the response followed established protocols that had been refined over centuries of disaster management. The first priority was assessment. Samurai officials were dispatched on horseback to affected areas with orders to report on the extent of destruction, the status of food reserves, and the number of displaced persons. These reports were compiled and forwarded up the chain of command, providing decision-makers with the information needed to allocate resources. The movement of relief supplies showcased the sophistication of feudal Japan's logistics networks. The main highways, including the famous Tokaido Road connecting Edo to Kyoto, were maintained by the shogunate as strategic arteries for both military and economic purposes. Along these roads, at intervals of roughly 10 kilometers, stood post stations called shukuba, where travelers could rest, change horses, and resupply. During volcanic disasters, these post stations transformed into distribution hubs for emergency aid. Daimyo, whose domains were unaffected by the disaster, were required by the shogunate to contribute rice, salt, and other essential supplies. These contributions were not acts of charity, but obligations inherent in the feudal contract. The rice was loaded onto pack horses and, in some cases, onto the backs of porters, who could navigate mountain trails too narrow for animals. The logistical challenge of moving tons of rice over mountains and through ash-choked valleys required coordination that involved hundreds of officials and thousands of workers. Yet the official response, crucial as it was, represented only one layer of the survival network. At the local level, temples and shrines emerged as critical nodes of disaster relief. Buddhist temples, in particular, possessed resources that made them natural relief centers. Most temples owned substantial landholdings worked by tenant farmers, generating rice income independent of the feudal tax system. Temples also maintained wells, often dug deeper than village wells, and had experience preserving food for their monastic communities. When volcanic ash began to fall, villagers instinctively sought refuge in temple compounds. There were the tile roofs and stone walls offered better protection than their own thatch-roofed homes. The monks organized these refugees, assigning tasks and distributing the temple's food reserves according to need. This was not purely altruistic. The Buddhist principle of compassion certainly motivated many monks, but temples also understood that their long-term survival depended on maintaining the goodwill of the surrounding population. A temple that hoarded its resources while villagers starved would find itself abandoned, its fields unworked, and its buildings unmaintained. The merchant class, despite their low status in the official Confucian hierarchy that placed samurai at the top and merchants at the bottom, wielded enormous practical power during disasters. Merchants controlled the distribution networks for everything from sake to textiles, and they possessed something that even wealthy samurai often lacked: liquid capital. In the aftermath of volcanic eruptions, when normal trade routes were disrupted and local production had collapsed, merchants who could source rice from distant, unaffected regions stood to make enormous profits. The shogunate understood this dynamic and implemented price controls during emergencies, threatening severe punishment for merchants caught engaging in what we would now call price gouging. However, enforcement was inconsistent, and clever merchants found ways to profit while technically complying with regulations. They would, for example, mix lower quality rice with premium varieties, maintaining the official price while degrading the product. Or they would claim that transportation costs had increased due to damaged roads, justifying modest price increases that, aggregated across thousands of transactions, generated substantial wealth. The peasant farmers, who comprised roughly 85% of the population, bore the brunt of volcanic disasters, but also demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and adaptation. When ash fall contaminated rice paddies, farmers did not simply abandon their fields in despair. They organized community work parties to remove the ash, a backbreaking process that involved scraping the surface layer of soil and carrying it away in baskets. In cases where the ash layer was particularly thick, farmers redirected irrigation water to create artificial floods that would help settle the ash and leach away some of the toxic compounds. This process could take months and depleted the soil of nutrients, but it was preferable to leaving the fields unworkable. Farmers also shifted to more resilient crops when rice production became impossible. Millet and buckwheat, though less prestigious than rice, could tolerate harsher conditions and shorter growing seasons. These grains had been cultivated in mountainous regions for centuries, and the knowledge of how to grow them spread rapidly during volcanic crises. One of the most remarkable aspects of Japan's resilience was the speed of reconstruction after volcanic disasters. Unlike stone cities in Europe or the Middle East, Japanese towns and villages were built almost entirely of wood, bamboo, and paper. This meant they were devastatingly vulnerable to fire and could be obliterated by pyroclastic flows, but it also meant they could be rebuilt quickly. The carpentry traditions of feudal Japan emphasized modular construction and standardized measurements. Temple carpenters, the most skilled in the land, used a measurement system based on the ken, approximately 1.8 meters, which allowed components to be pre-cut and assembled on site. This prefabrication meant that reconstruction could begin as soon as the immediate crisis had passed. Teams of carpenters moved from village to village, working for payment in rice, or, in cases of extreme poverty, simply for food and shelter. The forests that covered Japan's mountains provided an almost inexhaustible supply of timber, particularly the cryptomeria and cypress trees, prized for construction. However, volcanic eruptions could devastate forests as thoroughly as they devastated farmland, and the shogunate maintained strategic timber reserves specifically for disaster reconstruction. The architectural response to volcanic threats evolved over centuries of repeated disasters. Buildings in volcanic regions were constructed with steeply pitched roofs designed to shed ash before its weight could cause collapse. Thatched roofs, while flammable, were preferred in some areas because they were cheaper to replace than tile and could be quickly removed and replaced if damaged by ashfall. More importantly, the entire layout of villages and towns reflected an awareness of volcanic danger. Settlements were positioned to avoid areas that had been devastated by previous eruptions, creating a landscape where the ghosts of past disasters literally shaped the geography of the living. Ancient lava flows, now covered in vegetation, were left undeveloped. Valleys that funneled pyroclastic flows were avoided for permanent construction, though they might be used for temporary farming structures. This geographical memory was preserved not through written records, which were vulnerable to fire and flood, but through oral traditions passed down from generation to generation. Elders would walk the boundaries with young men, pointing out the stones that marked ancient destruction and warning them never to build in those cursed places. The cultural impact of living under the constant threat of volcanic disaster shaped Japanese philosophy and art in profound ways. The aesthetic concept of mono no aware, often translated as the pathos of things, or a sensitivity to ephemera, reflects an acute awareness of impermanence that was not merely philosophical, but existential. When a mountain could explode without warning and erase everything you had built, the fragility of existence was not an abstract concept, but a lived reality. This awareness manifested in art forms that celebrated transience. Cherry blossoms, which bloom brilliantly for only a few days before scattering, became the preeminent symbol of beauty precisely because their beauty was fleeting. The tea ceremony, with its emphasis on finding perfection in the imperfect and incomplete, reflected a worldview shaped by disaster and resilience. The tea masters of feudal Japan created spaces of tranquility and order, not in defiance of chaos, but in full acknowledgement that chaos was the natural state of the world. The political impact of volcanic disasters on the stability of the shogunate varied depending on the scale of the catastrophe and the effectiveness of the response. Small to medium eruptions that affected only a few domains could actually strengthen the shogunate's authority by demonstrating its capacity to mobilize resources and provide relief. Daimyo who received aid from the shogun were reminded of their dependence on central authority, while the common people witnessed the benevolence, real or performed, of their rulers. However, catastrophic eruptions that overwhelmed the response capacity of the system exposed the limitations of feudal governance. The Tenmei famine that followed the 1783 Asama eruption killed an estimated 900,000 people across Japan, and the shogunate's inability to prevent mass starvation led to riots in Edo and other major cities. These upheavals did not topple the government, but they eroded the ideological foundation of feudal rule, which held that the social hierarchy was ordained by heaven, and that rulers who governed justly would be rewarded with prosperity. When the mountains exploded and the people starved, despite the supposed virtue of their leaders, it became harder to maintain that narrative. Yet even in the face of such catastrophes, the system adapted rather than collapsed. The shogunate implemented reforms that included more extensive grain reserves, improved early warning systems for volcanic activity, and greater autonomy for local officials to respond to disasters without waiting for orders from Edo. The study of natural philosophy, while never as formalized as in Europe, included careful observation of volcanic phenomena. Monks and educated samurai recorded seismic activity, changes in volcanic hot springs, and animal behavior that might presage eruptions. While these observers could not predict eruptions with modern precision, they accumulated knowledge that allowed for some degree of preparedness. Villages near active volcanoes maintained evacuation routes and identified refuge areas on high ground away from potential pyroclastic flows. These preparations were drilled into the population through annual exercises, ensuring that even during the chaos of an eruption, people knew where to flee. The economic recovery from volcanic disasters often took years, but it was facilitated by the flexibility inherent in the rice-based economy. Because rice could be stored for multiple years without significant degradation, domains that escaped the disaster could loan rice to devastated regions with the expectation of repayment over time. These loans were calculated in koku and recorded in ledgers maintained by samurai officials. The terms were often harsh, with interest rates that would be considered usurious by modern standards, but they provided immediate relief that prevented total collapse. Merchants also extended credit, accepting promissory notes backed by future harvests. This credit system, while informal and based largely on personal relationships and reputation, allowed for economic activity to continue even when physical currency, in the form of gold and silver coins, was scarce. The legacy of volcanic resilience in feudal Japan extended beyond the period itself and shaped the modern Japanese approach to disaster management. The emphasis on community-based disaster response, the expectation that individuals would contribute to collective survival, and the acceptance of impermanence as a fundamental aspect of existence all have roots in the centuries, when Japanese civilization learned to coexist with exploding mountains. Modern Japan, with its sophisticated early warning systems, engineered infrastructure, and comprehensive disaster protocols, stands on the foundation built by the feudal villagers who learned to filter volcanic ash from their water, the samurai officials who organized relief convoys through devastated landscapes, and the monks who opened their temples to refugees. The volcanic mountains of Japan continue to rumble and occasionally explode, but the civilization that grew in their shadow learned not just to survive such disasters, but to incorporate that survival into the very fabric of their society. In the end, volcanic disasters did not destroy feudal Japan, because the Japanese people built a civilization that expected disaster, prepared for disaster, and knew how to reconstruct when disaster inevitably arrived.